Thank you very much indeed. I feel really honored to be part of this exciting event. Ladies and gentlemen, dear Mr. Donfried, thank you for the nice introduction. Madame Marie, merci beaucoup pour votre mot. My voice is similar to the United Nations. You may listen to it, but it could sound better. So I don't want to bring up some worries about the United Nations, but I would like to offer you some considerations and reflections on the German point of view in this regard. Nevertheless, ladies and gentlemen, I want to start with a citation of the German Chancellor who was heading the German government at the time where Germany joined the United Nations in 1973. It was Willy Brandt at that time. And he said at the United Nations General Assembly on 26 September 1973, quotation, "We have come to assume a share in the responsibility for world affairs on the basis of our convictions and within the scope of our possibilities." And this has developed, I think. Almost 28 years after the foundation of the United Nations, Germany entered, and the main idea was still the same, creating a unique platform to discuss global issues and to find common solutions and to solve conflicts peacefully. Established in 1945, the international community's direct response to the Second World War and Germany's crimes against humanity, this was the development of the United Nations, and this is also very closely linked to the German history at that time. And therefore, Germany, at that time with both parts, had a special responsibility as well as a special relationship to the United Nations. Throughout the 1950s, Germany struggled with regards to its relationship with the United Nations. Meanwhile, Germany, the unified Germany, is a widely respected member. In the next about 20 minutes, might be less, depending on my voice, might be longer, depending to my discipline, I would like to focus on how this relationship and participation of Germany have changed in the last years and how it should be changed in the future or could be changed. I will therefore focus on 5 issues. First of all, of the early involvement of Germany, then the reunified Germany in the United Nations. Third, some reflections of the role of the United Nations today. Fourth, also criticism of the United Nations and some careful wishes. After the Second World War, due to 2 main reasons, the UN membership for the 2 German states was unthinkable for many years. In 1949, the United Nations members initially regarded the 2 German states as enemy states. And second, the majority of population living in the destroyed post-war Germany focused on other issues concerning their livelihood and economic reconstruction and the building of new families after partition and separation. On the German side, thoughts about the future of German foreign policy were cast into the background. And the question of the German rearmament in the 50s, there was a strong strive for a European army at the time in Germany. And you know well that the French Assemblée Nationale was also keen to discuss the issue, but this project was buried in the mid-50s. And on the other side, Germany wanted to become a member of the Western society, and this is the merit to Adenauer, who also wanted the German unification, but not at the price or at the cost of a Russian hegemony over Germany. So it was a long way to the German unification, and this way led with a close alignment with the Western societies. And on the United Nations side, it remained open whether or not Germany could become a member of a free and peaceful world community. The first contact between post-war Germany and the United Nations remained the humanitarian work of different UN agencies. UNICEF, UNRRA, and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, for example. One of the first deployment of German troops after the Second World War was in 1960, a call of the United Nations to help at the earthquake in Agadir in Morocco, for example. Saying it in the words of the former West German ambassador to the United Nations, Alexander Graf Jörg von Wartenburg, quotation, "Back then all we knew of the United Nations were aid packages and school lunches from UNICEF." And this was in Germany. Second, the Cold War. Since the establishment of the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic, the so-called DDR, in 1949, the partition of Germany was really set in stone. An iron curtain was drawn across Europe. Two German states were continuously placed as the center of attention of the United Nations. The world's awareness was at Berlin and was also later on at the Berlin Wall. While the Federal Republic of Germany joined the humanitarian work of United Nations in the 1960s, the GDR did not join any UN specialized agencies caused by the West German blockade, also known as the Hallstein Doctrine. Nevertheless, the GDR was very much engaged in Africa and in Cuba, for example in Angola, as well as in some other communist African states. The so-called Hallstein Doctrine, this was a question of exclusivity. Western Germany was very keen to have only diplomatic relations to those states who avoid a contact to the GDR. And it was named after Walter Hallstein, leading civil servant at the German Foreign Office. The key doctrine in the foreign policy of the Federal Republic after 1955, and it was prescribed that Western Germany would not establish or maintain diplomatic relations with any state that recognized the GDR. On the other side, the GDR was unable to gain access to appropriate means that would enable an application for membership. So it was a deadlock, and this deadlock blocked the two states of Germany. And therefore, in the aftermath, it was really very helpful that Willy Brandt pursued an Eastern policy. It was called Ostpolitik, and this caused intensive efforts for both the two states of Germany. Therefore, from 1969 to 1973, there was achieved a lot of progress, and therefore the UN General Assembly put an end to this diplomatic isolation on 18th September 1973. And the United Nations decided to accept both parts of Germany as the UN's 133rd and 134th full members. And I think this was a huge act of faith, of mutual faith from the international community, and Germany is still appreciating that. And due to this experience, Germany is also very keen not to exclude any country from the United Nations, but to help to foster the necessary relationship to include also fragile or rogue states. What did the participation in the United Nations mean to Germany? The two German states' membership of the United Nations was a milestone in history, especially regarding the subsequent reunification. Remember, in 1973-74 also, the Conference of Security and Cooperation, the later OSCE, started with the result of an rapprochement between the western part of Europe and the eastern part. So the policy of détente in the late 1960s and early 70s made it possible for them to move closer to each other. This cooperation with the neutral environment of the United Nations enabled the two German states to build up mutual trust, not only amongst each other, but also in the world community. The two countries appointed their own diplomats in the numerous committees and working groups. And as diplomats, you are well aware that the normal exchange of views is not at the table, it's behind the curtain. And there it was really very helpful also for the German interstate diplomacy to have a forum, a neutral forum in New York. Some important issues. Due to the historical experience of the Second World War, the support of human rights initiatives stood at the heart of Germany's UN policy, as well as subjects concerning the environment, climate, and desertification. And also due to the re-education after the Second World War, especially in Western Germany, Germany was very reluctant to accept any military role in the international affairs, and this is valid in some regard also until today. However, it has changed in some areas, and I think it is a very good way regarding our engagement in also military affairs worldwide. Both countries played a diplomatic role within the international politics of peace. West Germany's non-permanent membership in the Security Council first was from 1977 to 1978, and the GDR, first elected as a non-permanent member to the UN Security Council, was also a step forward. Both parts of Germany were hesitating for a long time to participate in United Nations Blue Helmet missions. I just mentioned the historical experience of the Second World War. Avoiding of a possible encounter between the GDR's People's Army and the Federal Defense Forces during United Nations missions. And when I was in the so-called Startup East from 1990 to 1993, I learned a lot about the structure of the former National People's Army, and it was a very exciting moment from 1990 to 1993 to dismantle this army and to start with a completely refurbished armed forces in the eastern part of Germany. I come to my third point, the reunified Germany in the United Nations. The results of unification on the 3rd of October 1990, Germany's importance and stature in the international community increased dramatically, and it increased more than the German awareness about this fact. The task field of the United Nations has changed as well. The participation of Germany has changed, and there was a renewed engagement as follows. In 1990-1991, in the war at the Second Iraq War, that means the war at Kuwait, Germany tried to pay and paid about 11 billion Deutschmark, that means today about 8 to 9 billion euros, and tried to abstain from an engagement and delivered a lot of material from the former GDR, for the National People's Army. But there at that time, I remember very well, started the discussion that we could not abstain by paying. We should engage by ideas, by thoughts, by personnel, and as well by concepts. In 1992, Germany has its first Blue Helmet operation. It took place in Cambodia. First time the country had taken responsibility for a peacekeeping mission. From 1995 to 1996, Germany occupied a non-permanent membership in the Security Council. The participation in United Nations mandated military operations and other missions that contributed to the maintenance of international security, like UNPROFOR in Bosnia. Stronger German engagement in the fight against terrorism caused due to the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, and some of the attacks were planned at Hamburg and not in Afghanistan. The German participation in the Security Council mandated the ISAF operation in Afghanistan and in the anti-terror operation Enduring Freedom on the Horn of Africa. On the other side, there was an abstention of Germany while the Iraq War in 2003. This overshadowed the German membership to a large degree. It meant also a kind of rupture in the traditional West German foreign policy and caused a political weakness of the United Nations. But in the aftermath, I think the German decision at that time to abstain from this engagement was right, because the conditions which led to the Iraq War have been wrong. At least they have been also false. But on the other side, the engagement has shown that we have produced a rogue state and not a stable situation in Iraq, which is suffering from that also today. After that Germany exercised its influence through the Afghanistan dossier, its chairmanship of the Al-Qaeda Sanctions Committee, and as the leader of the working group entitled Children and Armed Conflict. Furthermore, German engagement in United Nations-led peace operations was always modest due to scope and military warfighting means. On the 1st of January 2013, Germany's most recent Security Council membership ended. On one hand, there is I make use of it, that's better. On one hand, there is retrospective documentation and analysis, but on the other hand, we also need to address current policy and focus on various future course settings for Germany. I would like to draw a very small part of my little speech to the abstention in the Libyan war 2011. In the aftermath as well, this decision might have been right. On the other side, we all should be very aware that military engagement should always be embedded in an overarching political concept. And if we had one at the time for Libya, we obviously would not fail in the current policy regarding Libya, which might lead to a separation or partition of this country. So I plea very strongly for military engagement, that's true. However, it needs to be embedded in an overarching concept for political reconciliation, reconstruction, and civil engagement. Let me discuss the role of the United Nations today. What can and what can't the United Nations achieve nowadays? Because of rising globalization and global problems, the existence of a global authority is necessary. That's, I think, is for sure. The United Nations is not only the General Assembly and Security Council. There are more than 150 specialized agencies of the United Nations, and their importance is really growing. For example, UNICEF, as well as the World Food Programme, and special programs taking care of migration and refugee camps. Keeping the public international law everywhere on earth is in the meantime unrealistic, as well as the responsibility to protect needs always to be embedded in national interests. The capacity to act of the Security Council in crisis situations is limited due to veto powers. And the situation as is reflects the situation after the end of the Second World War. The European Union is overrepresented, and Africa and some Asian areas are not represented at all. But this will not change as long as there are rights for veto and there is no political willingness for further reforms. And for us Europeans, we should be happy that some very important European powers are permanent members in this important Security Council. The last crises showed us the lack of maneuverability. Gaza, Syria, Iraq, Libya, East Ukraine, nuclear negotiations with Iran. Ambassador, these will be, I think, very difficult negotiations, and it will be very important what is the outcome and how reliable is the outcome. Furthermore, what can and what can't Germany aim for in the United Nations nowadays? The power of Germany is comparatively restricted, as Germany is no permanent member of the Security Council. Germany has really very good and excellent specialists in prevention of conflicts, in peacekeeping missions, and qualified civil personnel. Germany is nowadays, after the United States and Japan, the third biggest contributor of the regular budget. Notwithstanding, Germany has to worry about the ineffectiveness of the United Nations to some extent and needs to use other adequate platforms for different crises, for example, the OSCE for Ukraine. I think in our interest, and it should also be the interest of the European Union, is that we make use of the keyboard of the different organizations and the different bodies, so that we see the organizations as a also diplomatic instrument. For example, the European Union is acting asymmetrically against the Russian military threat. NATO serves as a power of reassurance and deterrence, but not in direct confrontation with Russia. And the OSCE is a very good instrument for legal issues as well as to monitor crisis situations. So we have to make more use of these instruments. And as regards the enable and enhance strategy of Germany, we see also the need to enable partners like the African Union, like the Arab League, if they are willing to be or to become coordinated or to become enabled and enhanced. But there is a lack of organizational efficiency in some areas of Africa as well as in the Near and Middle East. And it is, I think, the task of the European Union to be a partner to these regions and to help and assist these regions, because the United Nations are blocked to some extent by veto powers, and therefore we need efficient sub-organizations. I come to my second but last point, the criticism on the United Nations. Security Council and institutional reforms, as I just mentioned. The Security Council, with its 5 veto powers, reflects the power relations of the year 1945 and the post-war time. The world, and especially the kind of conflicts, have changed a lot. Humanitarian disasters, demographic changes, asymmetric warfare, and other challenges have increased. By contrast, the structures of the United Nations, not only of the Security Council, remain stable since 70 years, and they are highly obsolete. New powers make impressive progresses and demand a stronger voice. Referring to this, the Security Council needs to be reforming, or at least reforms need to be reflected. South America, Africa, as well as some Asian states should be represented better. Germany could be represented due to the fact that it is one of the biggest contributors, not only financially, but also in personal figures, and the biggest donor of development cooperation. Flagging European powers, France and Great Britain, shouldn't have any exclusive right of the Security Council compared to Germany. Some voices in Germany can be listened. However, a permanent seat in the Security Council for Germany is, and I dare to say this, really unrealistic. A compromise could be a European chair or a rotation principle, but I cannot imagine that powers like France or the United Kingdom would abstain or withdraw from their permanent seat. So there is a deadlock, but we have to be pragmatic and realistic, and therefore we need a very close European Union, a very close cooperation within the European Union, and a reflection on our common interests, and also the willingness of the permanent members of the Security Council to incorporate other voices. Second, the democratic legitimation. In the United Nations, only governments negotiate among themselves. Opinions of minority groups, for example, of the civil society or opposition parties, don't find a sympathetic ear in the General Assembly. This will lead to a loss of reputation and trust. The solution could be to establish a parliamentary assembly as a body of the United Nations. I'm the head of the German delegation in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Union for the Mediterranean. And I could imagine, we have it in the OSCE, we have it at the European Council, we have it with NATO, we have it in the Mediterranean, whether there might be the willingness to create such a body also for parliaments. However, more than 190 parliaments need to be then represented. This might create also a chaos of organization. However, we should reflect this. United Nations needs reforms in general to adapt to the multilateral world. Therefore, they need to be more efficient, more transparent, and more modern. In future, the alliances inside of the United Nations will be more important than the decision-making of the Security Council. that means bargaining, gains more importance than the simple representation of the different countries. Let me conclude with some small visions. First of all, I think we need pragmatic approaches instead of an optimism with tendency to self-deception. We should not over-assess and overestimate the need for changes, but we should also reflect the difficulties of a reform. Second, real representation of continents, beliefs, and ethnos balanced and equal. This is really a challenge, but I think it is necessary. Third, veto rights should be limited to reforms of the United Nations structures, but not of the United Nations engagement. Fourth, responsibility to protect must not be blocked by veto powers. I think this is also a nice sentence, but very difficult to bring it into reality. I thank you so much for your attention, and if there is a willingness or a time frame or so, I'm also ready to take part in the discussion. Thank you so much.